Hello and welcome back. In today's video, we will pick up the discussion on Indian GDP, where we left off in our previous video. Last time, we had discussed the methodology, and the data used, in the preparation of gross domestic product, or GDP in India. Today, we will try and understand and dissect the controversies and questions we had raised at the end of that video. These included questions like, why the GDP data does not show a complete or accurate picture of an economy. The second topic was about the specific problems faced in calculating the Indian GDP. Apart from this, we will also talk about the recent controversies relating to the Indian GDP figures, and those of its growth rate. The first controversy was about the doubts and concerns, expressed by economists and experts, on the government's attempt to change the base year for prices, used in the calculating of GDP. The second, was the issue around the growth figures of the Indian economy. And finally, the question, about whether India is going through a period of economic contraction, or recession. We shall take up the matter of changing of the base year first, because this subject can be talked about in isolation, while the rest of the issues are very much interlinked, and can truly be understood best when discussed together and cohesively. To be able to understand all the dimensions of the discussion that we are going to do in this video, you must be well aware of the concepts, methodology, and principles, which we had discussed and detailed in our previous video, as we will use these definitions and terminology today. This is why it would be a good idea to first watch our previous video on calculation of Indian GDP. For this, you can click the information icon in the top right corner, or access the video by clicking on the link given in the video description below. So if you are ready, let's get started. To begin our discussion on the proposed change in the base year, let us first take a look at the history of base years used in India. Prior to 1967, the year 1948-49 was used as the base year for national accounts. The prices from the year 1960-61 were started to be used from 1967. After this, we started using 1970-71 prices from January 1978, the 1980-81 series from February 1988, the 1993-94 prices from February 1999, the 2004-05 prices from 2006, and finally, the prices of 2011-12 series from 2015, which we continue to use as of 2020. Government of India is now pushing the idea of shifting the base year, from 2011-12, to 2017-18. To understand the controversy relating to this proposal, it is first important to understand why and when the base year should be changed. As we saw in the previous video, to conduct a comparative study across multiple years, especially in a country like ours, where the rate of inflation is high, we use the base year prices to calculate GDP at constant prices. But, with rapidly changing technology in existing products and services, their cost implications, and introduction of new, and the discontinuance of old products and services, we cannot use the prices of a very old base year. In our current state, it is generally considered a good practice to change the base year every 5 years. When making a base year switch, some factors need to be considered. These include the fact that the base years should not be changed too frequently, or the purpose behind the use of base years will be lost. Secondly, the base year should not be a year in which there has been any kind of extraordinary volatility or pressure in prices. For this reason, after the global economic crisis of 2008, India chose the 2011-12 series, after the economic conditions stabilized. Since the last change of the base year in 2015, a new series would have been a good idea, except for the fact that if we look at India's Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, for the recent years, we will see while our inflation rate has consistently stayed above 5%, on account of the twin shocks of demonetization and GST implementation, there was a sudden steep decline in the purchasing power of a large number of people, leading to a fall in demand in the year 2016 and 2017, which brought the CPI down to 2.5%. Now, if 2017-18 is made the base year, it will violate one of the basic tenets of change of base year, which is, to avoid any year of major economic upheavals. On the other hand, if instead of 2017-18, a year like 2015-16 was used, then by recalibrating the historical GDP to this new base, it would be possible to have a sense of continuity in the reading of GDP growth figures. In its meeting held in October 2019, the Advisory Committee on National Accounts Statistics has also recommended to the government to choose 2020-21 as the next base year. Despite all this, if the government persists in its intention of using 2017-18 as the new base year for government accounts, then questions are bound to be raised on government's intentions. Now, we come to the issue of Indian GDP figures, and controversies around the rate of growth of GDP. The first step for this would be to understand what the figure of GDP entails. There are two ways to calculate or measure anything. The first method, called enumeration, involves doing a count of every single unit, included in the group or universe, which we are studying. An example of such an exercise would be a census, where we knock on every door, and count every single person living in the country. The other method is estimation, where instead of counting everything, we make an estimate of the whole universe, based on a sample taken from the whole population. The electoral opinion and exit polls are examples of estimation. The GDP is also primarily an estimate because much of the information used in GDP calculations, like the data from NSO's sample survey, the budget estimates figures, or guesstimating one sector values, based on values of another sector, are all statistical estimations. In this respect, they suffer from the same flaws and limitations as any other statistical estimate. The most important of these limitations is the quality of sample used for the survey. Sample surveys are an important and universally accepted tool of statistics, but due to certain inherent flaws of sampling, we should look at all results based on sample survey data, including GDP, in light of these limitations. The first mistake can be made by choosing the wrong sample. The best sample is one which is a good reflection of the whole. We call this a representative sample. For example, if 50% of the population in the country is female, but mostly men were asked in the sample survey. Or in a case where 60% of the population is rural, but the sample is taken only from urban areas. Or, a survey on national consumption patterns is done only using phone, due to which, only those respondents would be included in the sample who have a phone. In all these examples, the population sought to be studied is not represented correctly in the sample, so these samples are not representative. Another drawback of sample survey is misinformation by respondents. For example, when questioned on information on income or expenses, or in case of opinion or electoral poll, the respondent end up giving false or misleading answers, either to deceive, or on account of coercion, or because of the way the questions were framed. A further problem can arise in sample surveys, when the sample taken is far too small, on account of a lack of resources, or time, or professional incompetence, such that the sample fails to capture a meaningful snapshot of the entire population. If the sample size is appropriate, there is a reduction in the probability of statistical error, on account of what is known as the law of inertia of large numbers. Another source of mistake is the wrong reasoning, or assumptions, that we apply in the process of estimation. We can understand this with an example. If, let us say, there was a rural poverty alleviation scheme, on account of which there was a positive impact on the income and poverty levels in the rural sector, to then extrapolate the same quantum of effect on cities as well, or assuming that the impact of implementation of a system like GST, on both the organized and unorganized sector would be identical, then both these arguments or assumptions would be wrong. Thus, any figure derived on a calculation based on such estimates would also give misleading results. Although, it must be said, that experts do take due precautions, and also use techniques to mitigate the impact of such flaws. Despite this, we have often seen the effects of these, when results of such calculations have come out grossly inaccurate, in many cases, such as the wide differences in the exit polls and actual results. After this general understanding, we come to some specific issues related to the calculation of Indian GDP. If we look at the section detailing the sector-wise data gaps in the GDP estimation, on the web page on the methodology of GDP calculation, on the NSSO's website, we see that, while a major source of information used in calculating GDP are the statistical departments of the various government ministries, in the opinion of NSSO, there is a lack of scientific approach in the methods of collecting information of these departments. Other issues relate to problems of resources in collecting and processing of the information by the government machinery. A tendency for giving old data, and even the possibility of giving wrong information, or suppressing of information, cannot be ruled out, on account of political pressures, and the need to show good performance. Due to the huge size of the country, and the shortcomings of the information gathering mechanism, the prices are not captured at the right place, and at the right time, due to which the production quantity and its price related to the same time period, are not matched correctly. The recent discovery in NSSO survey, of 36% of companies, data for which was taken for GDP calculation, were found to be inactive or misclassified. This discovery has again highlighted the question of the quality of information used in GDP calculations. The lack of response from a large number of companies and establishments from the organized sector, that are questioned in the annual survey of industries, is also a cause of concern, as regards the quality of data used in GDP computation. The entire unorganized sector estimate is based on the Index of Industrial Production or the IIP. The data pertaining to the unorganized sector is perhaps the biggest reason for the opacity in the figure of Indian GDP today. The first dimension of opacity arises from the fact that even after all these years, and all the progress we have made in garnering statistics, even today, no Indian, or international body, has any authentic figures on the size of India's unorganized sector. From time to time, estimates of 80 to 95% of the economy being in the unorganized sector are tossed around, but till date, no one has given any proof or source for these estimates. The second big issue, as regards the data of the unorganized sector, arises when in the calculation of GDP, we take the statistics obtained from the organized sector, for the quantitative and value-related estimates, for the unorganized sector. This is, when we know for a fact, that unorganized sector is far more agile, and variations in its shape and size, happen at speeds and quantum, which are very different, and many a times, unrelated to those in the organized sector. Also, the prices structure of the organized and unorganized sector, also varies significantly, on account of the difference in scale and cost factors of the two sectors. If we merely take a look at the effect of making inferences for the unorganized sector, based on organized sector, we will be able to get some idea of the gap between truth and GDP that we calculate. After the institution of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, there was a big increase in rural income and size of rural economy, especially in western and southern India. This suggests that if the quantum of growth of the organized sector was used to estimate the unorganized sector between 2006 and 2007, or when there was a situation of jobless growth in the organized sector, after the global crisis of 2008, but by increasing the allocation to Manrega, India was able to partially mitigate the impact of the global recession. In both these situations, we would have ended up undervaluing the unorganized sector in the GDP estimates. On the other hand, when the unorganized sector was severely hobbled, after demonetization and implementation of GST, again, If we estimated the unorganized sector based on organized sector, it would mean that we would have ended up overestimating the size of the economy. This is the reason, when the trailing effects of this contraction of the unorganized and rural economy later started reflecting in the larger economy, in data released in the year 2018 and onwards, many people were surprised by its magnitude and the speed of change. For this reason, initially, many apologists of the Indian growth story argued that this was a short-term and cyclical blip. For all these reasons, we see that we still need some more calibration of our system of estimation of GDP, before we can arrive at a better and complete estimate of our gross domestic product. Then the question that arises from this is, if there is so much opacity in the amount of GDP, and it is also clear that the GDP figure is not a true or complete reflection of the economy, then what is the rationale for its use? While these arguments underline a need for refining the GDP estimate, so that we can use more realistic figures to make policy decisions, such that every sector of the economy, and every group of people that is in need, can be targeted at the right time, and with the right solution. But even with these imperfections and flaws, if all the sectors of the economy are reasonably represented in the calculation of GDP, and the methodology is consistently applied year after year, without resorting to statistical jugglery, we are still able to get a fair idea of the pace and the direction of the economy, even when the amount of GDP is not perfect. This is on account of the fact that a large economy is not comprised of disjointed fragments, but in fact, operates like an intricate machinery, or an ecosystem of symbiotic organisms, in which the health of any one part of the economy depends intimately on its other parts. For this reason, instead of focusing on the quantum of GDP, the changes in it can still give us quite a lot of important information to work on. Finally, we come to the complex question, which is on the minds of many, which is, where does the Indian economy stand, and what is it going through today? An economy can be said to be in one of three states, in terms of its economic growth. When the size of the economy, as represented by its GDP, is growing at a decent rate, this stage is called the phase of growth. What is a good rate of growth, will depend on the size, nature, and the maturity of that economy. Whereas, for mature economies like USA, Germany, or Japan, a rate of 2% would be considered good. For developing countries, this rate would need to be much higher, as they will need more momentum to reach the level of prosperity of the developed ones. When the rate of increase in GDP becomes very low or near zero, then it is called a period of stagnation. And the third situation is one in which the rate of change in GDP becomes negative, that is, the size of the economy starts to shrink. When this weakness lasts for a small period of time, it is called a recession. By a purely technical definition, when an economy continuously shows a fall in GDP for 3 quarters, it is considered to be in a recession. If this recession is widespread and prolonged, then it is referred to as a depression. Questions on the health of the Indian economy began to arise, when, instead of recovering from the effects of the demonetization of 2016, and the GST implementation, in the subsequent year, quarter after quarter, various economic indicators, such as earnings, production, employment, etc. started moving into negative territory, along with closures and bankruptcies of companies and institutions. The problem was compounded, on account of the quality of, and the lag in, the data being disseminated, and also, the holding back of negative data by the government. In 2018, the former economic advisor to the Government of India published his study, based on selected high-frequency indicators like investment, imports, exports, loans etc., where he theorized that there had been an overstatement of the growth rate of the Indian economy, by up to 2%. Even while, this report, the mode of cherry-picking of indicators used, and its conclusions, were questioned by those defending the government, and there was no empirical way to finally settle this matter, one way or the other. By the dawn of 2020, various rating agencies and domestic and international institutions, and finally, the NSSO, had started slashing the GDP growth estimate for the fiscal 2020, which ranges somewhere between 4.5 to 5%. So, does this mean that this consensus figure reflects the GDP growth in India correctly, and consequently the GDP in India, even if at a lower rate, is still growing? Given all the discussion we have had so far, pointing strongly to the fallibility of GDP and growth figures, it would not be a bad idea to validate this conclusion further. We can do this by applying alternative approaches for calculating GDP to the data available. In the previous video, we had discussed the various alternative approaches to calculate GDP, namely the production, the income, and the expenditure approaches. In this video we also saw that for the calculation of Indian GDP, we measure the contribution of GDP of agriculture, mines, construction, and organized industries by applying production or output-based approach. Currently, under production methods, these sectors show a growth, but, when we look at the incomes across these sectors, be it the incomes in the rural economy, the industries, the mining businesses, and the construction sector, then we see that all these sectors have seen a decline in earnings both for companies as well as workers. In such a situation, any gains in GDP attributable to these sectors becomes difficult to digest. When indulging in such an exercise, it is very important to make it clear that irrespective of the approach we use, in the long term, all three deliver the same result. The different methods sometimes shift the timing of the capture of an item in GDP calculation. It is on account of this that we are able to compare the GDP of different countries, despite them using different approaches in the calculation of GDP. Having secured this understanding, we can even validate the Indian GDP by applying the method of calculation that we do not use at all in India for GDP calculation, which is the expenditure approach. If we look at the components used in this approach, in the context of India, we see that corporate profits, government spending, net exports, and the largest component in expenditure approach, personal expenses, all have shown a decline in India. Theoretically speaking, if we were calculating spending-based GDP, like many other developed economies, then surely there would have been seen a contraction in India's GDP. Given the fact that far more higher quality and comprehensive data is required to tie this up more conclusively, what can we draw from all this analysis? When the media and information in any society falls short of performing its functions, especially in a post-truth world, then non-traditional means and even grapevine become modes of validating the official information. On the same lines, when there are doubts on data, people should develop the ability and tools to get a sense of the reality by using anecdotal evidence. Instead of relying on numbers, one needs to develop an ability to assess the impact of these numbers on one's own reality. For example, when you see that the wholesale price index is falling, but retail inflation rising, it means that some middlemen are thriving at the cost of producers and common consumers. Similarly, consumer price index increasing at a rate lesser than a rise in your income would be a good thing, until you peel away the layers and see that the calculation of that index includes many products and services which you do not use, and prices of which have grown at a lower rate, whereas expenses like food, clothing, education and medicine have seen a phenomenal rise. Then suddenly, the consumer price index would seem like a smokescreen, and of no value to you. Therefore, it is important to move beyond being hypnotized and obsessed merely by data points, and keep your eyes open. You should develop a capability to validate the swirling storm of data and information, and reconcile it with the reality staring at you in the face. You must see the signs, like the downing of shutters of long-running shops in your neighborhood and in the city, closed banks and ATMs, shrinking markets and dwindling rush of customers, the ebbing employment opportunities among the youth in your family, and the growing despondency. You must keep verifying the validity of the data, in the light of reality and of the anecdotal evidence scattered all around you. In conclusion, what should be the outcome of any such analysis and brainstorming? Actually, there are a few things that can be done that can make GDP a potent tool for public good. First of all, the government and its institutions involved in preparation of statistics, should release correct and timely data. This requires continuous improvement in the quality of data, by using credible sources of information, and better methods, in line with international standards. Institutions like NSSO, engaged in data computation and dissemination, should be freed from government influence, both in terms of adequacy of resources, and autonomy of operation. Today, NSSO's calculation methodology is public, but beyond this, NSSO should also make public the raw data used in GDP calculation, so that there is greater transparency and understanding about GDP. This will give the experts an opportunity to spot inaccuracies, and suggest ways to make the GDP calculation better and more realistic. By getting the right data, the ability of the public, industry, and the domestic and foreign investors to take the right decisions at the right time will increase greatly, and also, the government will be able to frame the right policies targeted at the right segment of the economy at the right time. Providing authentic and reliable data will enhance its credibility internationally, as well as become an instrument for giving the right direction and momentum to the development of the nation. We hope you found both our videos on Indian GDP interesting and informative. For more in-depth understanding on this subject, we have given the link to a fairly comprehensive NSSO document on the method of Indian GDP calculation in the video description below. We have also given a link to a playlist with some good videos on the subject. If you, or someone you know, would prefer to watch this video in Hindi, you may use the link to the Hindi version given in the video description below. If you liked this video, then do let us know by clicking the like button. If you think that someone else you know will benefit from or enjoy the information given in this video, then please press the share button to share this video with them. To watch more of such interesting and informative videos from us, subscribe to our channel and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever we post a new video. If you need further clarification on the topic of this video, or have any thoughts, suggestions, or opinions that you would like to share with us, please do let us know by commenting in the section for comments below the video. And with the hope that you have a wonderful time. Until next time, have a great day.